Hello and welcome to tonight's Artists in Conversation. This event is in conjunction with the Fiber and Textile Art Exhibition, Threads Laid Bare, at Drake University's Anderson Gallery. I'm curator Emily Newman. Tonight, I'll be introducing two artists who are included in the exhibition and let them converse with one another. Questions from you, our viewers, are encouraged and will be answered towards the end of the discussion. Before we begin, I would like to acknowledge the Iowa Arts Council with funding from the National Endowment of the Arts for their support of this exhibition and its programming. I would also like to acknowledge that the land upon which the Anderson Gallery at Drake University sits is the traditional, ancestral, and unceded land of the Iowa tribe of Kansas and Nebraska, the Iowa tribe of Oklahoma, and the Meskwaki Nation of the Sac and Fox tribe of the Mississippi. I would also like to thank Lydia White, Anderson Gallery student worker, and Julia Franklin, Anderson Gallery manager, for their technical support of the exhibition and programming. And thanks to our artists, Nicole and Gwen, for their commitments to this exhibition and generosity of time. And thank you, our virtual viewers, for joining this event tonight. The two artists with us this evening use differing degrees of representation in their artwork, ranging from representational to abstraction, but share similar processes as artists. I will be introducing each artist separately, but will allow the power of live stream to zoom to their screens so that they will introduce their own artwork. After each artist has been introduced and we have a sense of their artwork and practice, I will join Nicole and Gwen together for our conversation. First up, artist Guen Montgomery received both of her degrees in studio art with an emphasis in printmaking. Her BFA from the University of Hawaii and her MFA from the University of Tennessee in Knoxville. She has recently shown at the KIPP Galleries on the campus of Indiana University, Pennsylvania, and the Sheldon Art Gallery in St. Louis, Missouri. Gwen has been awarded a funded residency at the Vermont Studio Center and invited to Pentaculum Fibers residency at Aeromont School of Arts and Crafts. Her work is in the collections at Centre for the Art and Design in Churchill, Australia, and Musashino Art University in Tokyo, Japan. Gwen works in Urbana, Illinois, where she teaches at the College of Fine and Applied Arts at the University of Illinois and lives with her wife, cats, and dog. Welcome, Gwen.
Hi, all. Thank you. And I am just sharing my screen now.
Sounds good.
All right. Thank you so much. I really appreciate it. And I'm so happy to be here. It's funny to feel nervous when I'm sitting in my office, just at home, but I'm thrilled to be with all of you. So my name is Guen Montgomery. I have a background in theater and printmaking, and both of those things continue to influence my work, sometimes whether I want them to or not. In my work, I think a lot about material culture, possessions, and the ordinary. My work tends to not be bound to a particular media. Instead, it's more linked through theme and ideas, concepts. This is an example. These are three different ways that I have thought about depicting my paradoxical and infuriating uncle. My early print work and installation was really dependent on family narratives. And this is because I'm fascinated with my mom's family and my mom and grandmother, who live in Big South Fork area of Eastern Tennessee. So a rural part of Tennessee about 2 hours north of Knoxville. I first started thinking about them and myself and my relation to them as an insider and an outsider when I attended graduate school there, existing as a graduate student in Knoxville and then going home in the weekends to my family in Appalachia. I've thought a lot about how much life changes from generation to generation, particularly thinking about my mom and I, who are twins in a sense. We physically look quite a bit like each other. If you saw my mom at 36, you would basically be seeing me. We once got in an argument over whether a picture of me was a picture of her. It was a picture of me, but to this day, there's still some debate about that. Basically, our lives are super different. My mom grew up eating squirrel because that was one of the food sources, wearing one pair of shoes until the soles fell out of the shoes. She had 9 brothers and sisters. Her father was a coal miner. They lived in a 1-bedroom cabin, and they had an outhouse. She didn't leave the hill that she grew up on until she was a teenager. On the other hand, I am an only child of divorced parents. So I had 2 houses. My dad was he's retired, an airline pilot. I have all kinds of privilege, and I lived in Hawaii for an example of that. The fact that that switch happened in one generation has always boggled my mind. Probably because of generational poverty, there's a lot of emphasis in my family on possessions and belongings and objects. Having versus not having is a big undercurrent of my family culture. And I think obviously that's related to socioeconomic status, but I feel like it's also a kind of family pathology that maybe borders on hoarding. Anecdotally, I have an aunt who lives in an old house that is so filled with junk that recently she was bit by a copperhead in her house because the copperheads had moved in and made a nest because of the mice that were already living in the house. And she is fine. She is just fine after this incident, and it inspired my family members to get together in an effort to dig her out of her own stuff. This is my graduate thesis work. This is the Cecils of Scott County, a legacy estate collection. It's a critical but humorous and loving look at the striving for self-importance that my family takes part in via their tenuous Anglophilic claim towards greatness, ancestral greatness, specifically via genealogy. My uncle is the family genealogist. He believes we're related to the Cecils that served on the court of Queen Elizabeth I. This whole thing is a fairly problematic and common white person thing. White people like to seek out hereditary ties to other rich, important white people. I think it makes their lives feel meaningful. I say that it's a problematic white person thing because even being able to trace your genealogy, your genetic history, is a kind of privilege. I also see the obsession with genealogy as one way that white supremacy perpetuates itself. So I recognize that there's a difficulty there. And in talking about this work, I want to be clear that my Appalachian family is poor, but that doesn't make them racially innocent. They benefit from being white in a myriad of other ways. This project was about understanding my family through our mythology, trying to walk this difficult line between criticality, even poking fun at them, and loving them and honoring them. I've been fascinated for a really long time with estate museums or living museums, places where you can see an amazingly wealthy family's furnishings and furniture just as they were, supposedly frozen in time. These works are playing with the authority of the museum, the supposed neutrality of that space or false neutrality. And these tableaus that I set up and fabrics and wallpapers are all printed with these hillbilly family crusts that I invented over and over again in motif. I made a series of absurd sewn pillow form stand-ins for my family members, and I depicted them as iconic, almost stereotypical European royalty. I think about how they would loom uncomfortably behind you if you were to ever sit next to them on a couch. These are the pieces that you see in Threads Laid Bare, or some of the pieces, and they've been both exhibited as part of the estate installation and as sculptures on their own separately. My later work starts dealing with possession and inheritance in a very different way. Our collected objects and our keepsakes often amount to an attempt to freeze time. We see them as these constant things in relation to our changing, aging, fallible bodies, but they also reflect the passage of time. These are pieces which are made from heirloom objects, reclaimed family heirlooms, and they'll fade as that atmospheric sulfur returns to the metal and retarnishes it. In making these, I was thinking about how our objects outlive us, the inevitability of time passing and loved ones dying, and how objects can haunt the present with human pass. I began thinking about heirloom and inheritance and how they're tied more to structural privileges that value some human bodies over others. I was thinking about how these implications are often pretty invisible to the recipient of the passed down heirloom. This work was made post-2016. I kept the phrase "just desserts" kept reoccurring to me, and I was mulling over what it meant to have a kind of white entitlement, or what we're entitled to. The 2016 election strongly influenced my work, both in terms of thinking about whiteness and race, but also thinking about misogyny, particularly internalized misogyny. I created this piece right after that election. My frustration with the extremely misogynist public discourse around Hillary Clinton, who we couldn't seem to see as a human individual, was a big part of my impetus for making this work, but also it's critical of a certain kind of middle-class, middle-aged white woman who I feel is complicit in patriarchy and white supremacy, so that she's located in this weird equilibrium between subjecthood and objecthood that's uncomfortable, particularly because I know these women and I'm related to these women. In Tennessee, my mom worked for years and years and years as a housekeeper for this narcoleptic, aging beauty queen, ex-mayor's wife, who was essentially a rich white lady who regularly disposed of perfectly good, identical blonde wigs. My mom would save them for me, and I started to make artwork with them, and have for years. I've used them in multiple works. I similarly began to acquire other disposed belongings and started relief printing them as portraiture. I see these objects as representative of a particular woman who is mentally trapped in her prime, but has grown old and is no longer valuable as an object, and so has become invisible. Similarly, these Priscilla monotype relief prints are made after this particular woman passed away. They're sourced from her wigs and from an extensive collection of unworn silky nightgowns that I acquired from an estate sale for a woman who was a contemporary of the wig lady. They were friends and they passed away at a similar time. So I created these sort of hybrid memorial portraits of women who were performing a very specific, very rigid kind of femininity during the atomic age and who got lost there. These prints are a kind of taxonomic record of the nightgown collection, as well as obviously portraiture. I later worked back into them with screen printed color in the background. I wanted to bring back some of the materiality of the clothing and also reference their over-the-top lives and personalities through pattern. I've continued to work with reclaimed possessions. I choose these objects based on the fact that they're charged with the absence of someone, usually someone important to me, and that they can then be a stand-in for the person to whom they once belonged. I see these works as a conversation between everyday objects and print processes that are essentially born of studio play and material exploration. These are similar prints, these are similarly made, and sometimes people in the past have referred to the way that I'm making these prints as collograph, because collagraphs are created by glue mounting an object or a texture onto a plate or block, which is then rolled up with ink, usually relief style, but it could be an etching, and impressed then onto a paper surface. These are done similarly, but they do not have glue in them, so I've stopped referring to them as collograph, as collograph refers to the root of that word refers to glue. This process, though, creates really interesting images that are symbolic representations, but they're also recorded physical evidence of this now absent source object that's been pressed into paper or fabric. I really value this practice. I think it's so interesting, the haptic magic that happens when a relief print like this can replicate texture to the point where it signals touch. It actually feels like it is touch. And it also creates new actual textures through heavy embossment that you could actually feel. Because I print directly onto fabric or paper from found garments or sometimes fabricated objects, the prints are made without any kind of traditional printmaking matrix. This means that they are kind of like an X-ray. You can see both sides of the object at once, and it gives the viewer a kind of omnipotent understanding of the object. These are both pieces that are made from my underwears, from my grandmother's undergarments. The late bloomer was made from slip shorts that were once common and becoming common again. These are objects that neither my mother or I could stand to throw away, but also things we don't want to keep. The directness of the collograph or monotype relief process is nice because it subverts the static fixed matrix that printmaking so often relies upon. It's really direct, and what you see instead is this heightened moment of the object's contact with the paper. Ultimately, these discarded garments that I save are made more seductive, I think, and even more visible than maybe they were before, ultimately replacing the people they were meant to memorialize or represent. I'm now interested in slightly changing the domestic narrative that is inherent to the garments that I frequently have because they belong to women in my family. I want to change that narrative and guide it by inserting things in pockets, making them more monumental or architectonic. This is a similar approach. This summer I was experimenting with replicating a garment's actual color through screen print in a combination of screen print and monotype relief process that reminds me of a kind of like super time intensive mimetic joke, because it attempts so hard to be the thing, to be photographic, and yet the root there is onerous. This is my grandmother's nightcap that she slept in, and you'll see it also appear in a lot of my works. The control top underwear. All this stuff is coming back in style. Just briefly, a peek into my process. I know that's something that students in art are interested in. This is me screen printing fabric in preparation to use it as a background or part of an installation. Similarly, collograph printing on fabric This is a new experiment into creating laser cut objects that are my actual objects that I scan in and then try to reproduce as faithfully as possible. Initially, this came from wanting to insert specific objects into the pockets of the garments I was working with, but later it became about the objects themselves and allowing them to tell a story. This entire endeavor was a kind of celebration of material play and studio experimentation. I call this color porange. It's a hot porange, hot pink orange. Printing my crocheted net bag. That's actually a proof. And then this is the final carrier bag piece with the net printed on layers of relief printed fabric and objects with the collograph fabric in the background, and another variation with a screen print fabric, screen printed fabric in the background. This piece I made in June 2020, that's its title, June 2020, after the murder of George Floyd. I was moved and gripped by the air of revolution at the time. And it's an air that I still feel is happening, although we're sort of in the middle of history, so it's hard to see it. And I think this was part of my wanting to be able to take a moment to step back and see it. Curator Amy Powell of the Krannert Art Museum organized a mutual aid project, and I submitted this as part of art to raise money for that project. And I made it by embroidering one of the disposable masks that I found discarded in the street. And it was important to me in this piece to reverse the subject ground, but essentially it's attempting to be a record, a very physical record of a moment. This kind of embroidering, though, has gotten me excited about the relief printing possibilities of hand and machine embroidery. This piece is a mashup of John Lewis, Donna Haraway, and Judith Butler. Kind of an homage. I was thinking about the power and potency of the word trouble. My work is becoming increasingly fiber and installation based, and I'm thinking more now of my hybrid practice in terms of theater again, of costume, prop, and set. All of my most recent work you can see in a show in Wausau, Wisconsin at the Center for Visual Arts with amazing ceramicist Sam Brigel. Check it out if you end up in Wausau, Wisconsin. And thank you so much for your time today.
Thank you, Gwen. That was amazing. I'm just like amazed by all of the labor that everything takes. And I wanted to probably talk to you about that in a little bit, but thanks for sharing. All right, I'm going to introduce our second artist, and I'm so happy she's with us here this evening. This is Nicole Davis. She received her MFA with honors from the University of Iowa in painting and drawing with a secondary emphasis in printmaking. And she also received her MS in special education from Illinois State University. Nicole's recent exhibitions include Art Space Gallery at Black Hawk College in Moline, Illinois, Legion Arts in Cedar Rapids, and the Figge Art Museum in Davenport, Iowa. Her work was recently acquired into the Black Hawk College Art Collection. She is the recipient of numerous scholarships to complete her studies at U of I. Nicole lives and works in Iowa City and enjoys watching Netflix and eating cashew milk ice cream. Awesome. I'm thrilled to have you here, Nicole. Thank you for joining us.
I'm really glad to be here and to be seated and to be on screen. So, So thank you very much for having me. I'm really excited to be a part of this exhibition. So let's get started with my PowerPoint. Okay, so as was mentioned, I currently reside in the Midwest. I grew up in the Midwest, and I've spent most of my life here. I was a special ed teacher for 21 years. All right, hang on. Let me get my screen together for you. All right. There we go. Okay. So I was a special ed teacher for a couple of decades and decided to kind of switch gears and all right, let's see. I'm sorry about this confusion. Let me get.
You're okay. Do you know how to get that application screen up?
Yes. So application window.
Nicole, let us know if you would like one of us to share the PowerPoint, and then you can just talk if you want.
Yeah, why don't you go ahead and do that?
All right, we will get that started, and then
Okay.
you will just let us know when you want us to move forward, okay?
Okay. All right, that's great.
Sounds good. Yeah.
So like I said, I was a special ed teacher for a couple of decades and decided to kind of switch gears and pursue a career in art because it was something that I had wanted to do previously and just didn't. And so kind of full circle, here I am doing what I probably should have done 30 years ago. So I just graduated from the University of Iowa. Go ahead and forward the screen. And I started working in textiles while I was there as a way to kind of ground myself. So my work evokes personal, ancestral, and cultural memory as a form of sustenance and resistance within our current societal structure that chooses to elevate whiteness, maleness, and greed. Drawing attention to that which has been marginalized and challenging harmful power structures allows me to tell a story that is different than the one larger society declares as truth. It is through this practice that I sustain my humanness and resist and transform the forces that wish to deny it. So being a Black woman in a predominantly white institution, I really started to feel ungrounded. And one of the things that I just instinctively turned to was my family. And I started to use my family's story, my story as a basis for my art making. Go ahead and advance the slide. So one of the things that really drives my practice is the idea of using reclaimed objects. I really was drawn to this quote by Joanne Cubs about the language of junk and how it can be used for imaginative purposes or to memorialize, to evoke illusions. So those are really things that like really kind of started to speak to me. And as I started to, I call it commune with my ancestors while I was making this artwork, I really felt like I was kind of doing those things. One of the things for me, as far as personal and ancestral memory goes, my grandmothers and my aunts all kind of did handwork. I found myself in a painting program and kind of feeling like I didn't really want to paint, like it wasn't really speaking to me the way that I wanted it to. I wasn't able to speak through it the way that I wanted to. And I was already using fabric in my paintings. So at the time, I think it seemed like a leap, but in hindsight, I kind of see the through line to how I got to from painting to textiles. So kind of tapping into that embodied knowledge, tapping into the things that I learned as a child, my grandmother teaching me to crochet, just watching my grandmother embroider or an aunt knit or sew. So just kind of returning to those kinds of things to ground me. And then as far as cultural memory goes, just the idea of Black folks kind of taking something and making nothing out of it. Being able to, you know, create genres of music like hip hop, you know, hip hop being fragments of other music or jazz or even fashion and styles of dress, and how there's that idea of making something out of nothing, this idea of bringing together disparate pieces to create some sort of new whole. And there's, I feel like, a sense of intelligence and ingenuity in that. And that's also something that I really wanted to tap into with my artwork. Advanced slide, please. So in addition to my family and my culture as a basis for my artwork, there are numerous artists that I'm influenced by, but two of the top I'm going to share with you. And the first are the quilters of Gee's Bend. If you look at the quilt on the left, that's a quilt by Loretta Petway. The one on the right is a quilt by Mary Lee Bendoff. And they're both women who live and work in Boykin, Alabama, which is the formal name for Gee's Bend. And it's an isolated community, rural community, with a long tradition of quilting, and really having their own style of quilting, which is really based on improvisation. And so that's one of the things that really draws me to the Gee's Bend quilters, that idea of improvisation, the idea of using scraps. They use shirt tails and skirt tails and just, you know, the parts of worn clothing that were still usable, to create these quilts for functional purposes, because, you know, it was important to be able to stay warm, but also for aesthetic purposes. Go ahead and advance the screen. So the second artist who really influenced my work is Sam Gilliam. He's an abstract painter. I really love how he took the painting off the stretcher, has it draping in space, has it existing in space in an animated way, in a way that kind of reminds me of like spirits that have been embodied. So he's still working, and actually now kind of really getting, I think, some of his just due in the art world. So go ahead and advance the slide. So as far as my work goes, like I said, I like to use reclaimed materials. And for me, using reclaimed materials kind of serves as a metaphor for the things that are cast aside in society. We live under these structures of white supremacy and patriarchy and capitalism. And these structures kind of warrant that we cast certain people aside based on, you know, certain characteristics. And so for me, reclaiming materials is akin to reclaiming people and culture and bringing it back from the margins and letting it live in the light and take up space. So what you're looking at now are two pictures of screen printing panels that I did. So these are two panels. Well, it's actually one panel, and then the one on the right is kind of a closer depiction of it. But it's a sheet that's been cut in half, and then I just kind of went a little wild with screen printing. I burned textures into the screens, and then, you know, just randomly, you know, screen printed on the sheets. For me, it was kind of a return in a way to painting. So I like, you know, kind of like how painterly they look. That was, for me, important, along with all of the layers, because I feel like it's a collapsing of time and space, the collapsing of past, present, and future, which I feel is kind of important in my work, since I work with the ancestors. So you can go ahead and advance the screen. So these are two pieces where you can see where that sheet texture ended up. So the one on the left is Slump. It was done in 2020. It was actually the first piece that I did in quarantine, and it actually kind of made me laugh when I got done with it. Just to see this feeling that I was having embodied and kind of like hung on the wall in this quirky little form. And then on the right, that piece is actually the first quilt, actually, that I made. That sheet was the first time I screen printed onto fabric. And so this was my first exploration with that. Go ahead and advance the screen. And so these two pictures are an examples of the untitled Aretha piece that's in the Threads Laid Bare exhibition. So on the left, you see just the start of it, just the screen printing on a quilt that I had reclaimed from a rummage sale. On the right, you kind of see how I ended up piecing it together. I ended up cutting it in half and then kind of sewing it end to end, so it became that top banner there. And then on the bottom right, there's also some panels of dish towels that have been screen printed on. Go ahead and advance the screen. And then this is the final piece. And this is actually, for me, the first piece that became that had like the draping and shape to it. So that was definitely an exploration. After seeing the quilt on the wall, I was just kind of like, not quite done yet. and then just kind of took it down and started playing with it. Next slide. So my current studio practice has changed the way that I work. I have a home studio now. So I had to move out of the art building and no longer had access to the facilities there and to all of that room to work in. And so I'm working in my back bedroom, which has kind of changed the way that I work. So I have my sewing machine set up, my fabric in the bins on the shelves, you know, the small table to iron on. And if you advance the next slide, this is my living room, and this is where I piece the work. So the picture on the right is what my living room looks like when I'm in the process of creating artworks now. And so I piece them up front, and then I carry them to the back bedroom and sew them together and bring it back up and do some more piecing. The photo you see on the left turned into the piece that you see on the next slide. You can go ahead and advance. And so these pieces and how I'm working now, since I can't have the visual texture with the screen printing, I really wanted to have more actual texture. And so bringing in latch hook panels and afghans kind of helped to push that forward for me. So go ahead and advance. And so I'm also then working in modular ways. And so for me, this is kind of like what I would call a modular quilt. So I can work on the 3 pieces, and then when I have room or when I'm in the gallery, hang them to form a larger piece. Go ahead and advance. And this is another example of just how I'm kind of working in a modular way. So this is a piece that's made with t-shirts, kind of these nasty white t-shirts that I buy from thrift stores that have pit stains, and they're really worn so much to the point where they're being bundled and sold as rags as opposed to clothing because no one, would buy them. And so these have been dyed using natural dye and synthetic dye, and then sewn into panels and then hung as a whole piece. So I really feel like I'm still kind of in that mode of kind of collaging things together, of pulling kind of disparate elements to make a whole, and really using these reclaimed materials that speak to me and that speak to memories that I have. Go ahead and advance the slide. So thank you for listening. If you'd like to see more work, you can look at my website. You can also contact me through my website if you're interested. And my Instagram is also there.
Thank you. Sorry, I was muted. Thank you so much for sharing all of that work. That was really wonderful. And to see your process, which seems like you're transitioning in real time to this almost like a new way of working too, right? Like I think both of you, that's something that I'm noticing that you shared, and I'm so grateful that you shared with us, is things that are like kind of new ideas, new directions that maybe are just happening this summer, for instance, as you're sort of dealing with, ending your graduate time, not having access to that studio, dealing with the pandemic, dealing with all of these sort of racial injustices that are just being pushed to the forefront, and the fight for those things. And then, yeah, there's just a lot. And so you're both responding in really interesting ways. I wanted to ask you both a couple questions, and then we've got some questions from the viewers. And so I'll maybe make this a little bit quicker, but I kind of want to return to this idea of possessions. So you both talk about working with found things, some in ways where you're deconstructing like fragments of things, and some as whole objects. And I'm really interested, I've been having these conversations with my husband actually a lot about how he's from a very blue collar background, and we're having these discussions about how possessions become a sort of currency in a way, because you hold on to them, because you either have to be resourceful with them, but kind of even more so now, you could possibly make some money off of them in the future. So you sort of hoard them in a weird way. We've been talking about that more personally, but I wonder about your desire or need to collect possessions. Like when, and this is not necessarily art-based, but when did this start for each of you? Like, not necessarily to use it in your artwork, but do you carry on that from either family or just sort of this need to hold on to things? Does that, I don't know. When do you take note of that? When did you take note of your collections?
I think for me, my collections have always revolved around kind of art, in a way. For me, it really revolves around art. I actually made a point, maybe 10, 15 years ago, where I was moving and I was having a yard sale, and like I was pulling stuff out to sell, and like filled up the whole backyard. And I was just like, how does that happen? Like, I'm one person. Like, how did like all of these things amass? And from that point on, I really like tried to be more cognizant of like, if I don't need it, don't get it. If I'm not using it, don't keep it. But when it comes to art, like all of that has like broken down. And, I have a nice collection of fabric. I'm becoming obsessed with latch hook rugs. So yeah.
Yeah, I have a student who recently got into tufting, and I've become obsessed with tufting. I want to learn. She got herself a tufting gun, and now she's tufting everything. I know.
Those things are fancy. I just have the little hand tufter, which is like a single thing.
Right? Yeah. No, this is like, it's amazing. But she, that's beside the point, except I covet the tufting gun and I relate to the latch hook love. I think that collecting and like penchants towards material hoarding was pushed on me. It's like part of my family culture. I think that's how we describe love. Reciprocity is a big part of family. So you don't go anywhere without bringing a gift. And like, I don't go home without a gift from my mom, even if it's something that I've gotten at the thrift store. It shows that I've thought about her in an abstract way and her happiness. And this gift is representative of all of my intentions towards her. And so there's gift giving culture is really big. And I have a collection of porcelain dolls that I would like to get rid of that I don't know what to do with, because they were given to me by my grandmother and my aunts, and they're not fancy. They're not nice. I mean, I don't know what a nice porcelain doll is, but they're the kinds of things that you would buy at like a drugstore in the 80s. And I should get rid of them. There's no purpose. I made a Halloween costume once out of them, which was kind of useful, but now I just keep them because of the pain getting rid of them feels like getting rid of the intention of that person who's gone. And so I think that through emotional manipulation and family culture, I was sort of trained into collecting and hoarding.
Gotcha. For both of you, what has been a really, like a surprisingly powerful object or even maybe textile to work with? So, because Nicole, I know you use more like found textiles. So what has been, and Gwen, I know you use these objects, something that was maybe not as powerful as you thought, or maybe didn't even you didn't even think about, but suddenly became something that held a lot more meaning. Or maybe you don't have one, but I don't know.
I think for me, it was the kind of nasty t-shirts that I kind of collected. Like for me, like they meant something, but sometimes that doesn't translate to other people. And so I think working with them and seeing how it affected other people was surprising to me. Like to see that translated, that it meant so much to me, that I don't know, that it also translated, and that people also saw stories and memories like within. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Gwen, what about you?
No, I mean, I think that it's weird how things feel universal, like the cap that my grandmother slept in is very meaningful to me, and I wasn't sure if that would have any kind of resonance with other people. You think of those things as being so individual, but obviously it's not. It was a commercially made thing that many people had, and so I think I'm sometimes surprised by that. I'm also surprised by what connotations people have with the things, whether it's a mother or grandmother, or if it's something different. I don't know. I think that there are some people who see the imagery as very nostalgic, and other people who have, for whom those objects are evocative of bad memories, of things that don't aren't the fantasy of home and femininity, but the opposite in a way. And that's more interesting to me. And I'm hoping to push the work more in that direction, because I don't want people to get trapped in a kind of nostalgia loop with the objects. I want them to recall something more difficult. Right.
So that it becomes more of a conversation, maybe even internally, where you're in that uncomfortable place, rather than sort of I remember that too. And then.
Right. Exactly. Yeah.
Have you thought about ways to do that? Are you still thinking through that? I think that's really interesting.
Yeah, I am thinking through it. I mean, for me, representation is really important, and it's always difficult. I find this tension between, my love of the actual thing, the feeling that the actual thing has almost all that it needs, but needing to transform it in some fundamental way. And then the fact that representation is sometimes such a, straight line A to B thing. It's harder to introduce liminality, or for the conversation to be as open when a thing looks like a thing. So I'm playing with ways of retaining the representation that I think is important to me and my work, and playing with non-representational gestures as a way of breaking that up. I think color is another way that I've started thinking about that. And also, that was a big part of my desire to start putting tools and weapons and other things inside these, into these images, and fabricating them more, so I have a little bit more control over that.
Yeah, I was going to say, I think like the things in pockets become these strange juxtapositions too, right? Like you're sort of starting to think about time and place in a different way than maybe even, or like even sometimes the initial object, the large fabric print draws you in, but then seeing all those little things, suddenly you are pushed back and almost create a new narrative that wasn't there before, So
Right.
recontextualizing, I guess.
Yeah.
Yeah. Nicole, I wanted to ask you quick. When I was an undergrad, I had a grad student professor actually who bought a 1,000 or a ton bale of clothing, and we were supposed to make work from it, and she just cut the bale and we had to make work from it. And one thing I remember from it was the smell, because this was all things that wouldn't be sold at the thrift store. They were rags. Like they were either going to developing countries to be sold there, or they were going to be cut up and used into rags. And I wondered too if through especially with your t-shirt one, if smell is something that becomes incorporated as you're working.
Yeah, it's interesting that you asked that, because those t-shirts, I don't know if the viewer, if they pick up on it or get close enough, or but I still smell I don't know, it's the people or the oils from the people, or
body smell. I remember.
Yeah. And it's fascinating, because the ones that were dyed with natural dye, I literally boiled them on the stove in a pot for 2 hours, washed them in the wash machine, dried them in the dryer, and you can still smell it. And that just, it fascinates me. It really just all of that's still in them and that still lives in them is just, it's mind-boggling to me.
Yeah. I think we're going to turn to some questions from the commenters who are watching, just so we can get a few in here. And I think everybody's okay. This was Hedera. These were in relation, or I'm sorry, this is from Hedera. And I think this was a part of Gwen's, but I think, Nicole, I think it's applicable to you in terms of printmaking.
Yeah, printmaking takes forever, and there's no reason to do it. I mean,
except if you want multiples.
Yes. Well, for me, it's not just the multiple, it's not just the multiplicity, it's the fact that you can, it's this weird removal of process. I love processes. I love things that require you to follow a series of steps. And I like things that are kind of like a collaboration between you and the physical world. There's kind of like a dance that you have to do with this machine or press or screen. There's choreography to it, and I really love that about it. And I also love that element of surprise or transformation that I think happens because my intention is a little bit removed, or it's out of my control a little bit. But to answer your question, it takes a long time. It depends on which process you're doing. There's something really immediate about printing the relief monotypes because I'm actually inking the object up and printing it. I would say that screen printing repeat patterns on fabric take a long time if you want them to look like a commercially made object.
Yeah, and it does take a long time, and I'm the opposite of Gwen. I don't like which is so funny because I think that printmakers come in and see me work and they're like, oh my gosh, she's crazy. What is she doing? That's not printmaking. Because, I'm just doing whatever, I'll pull the screen and put the squeegee down and it leaves a mark. And so then I'll take the fabric and sop up that ink. And so it's really just kind of free form. But it's still hard work. It's really, yeah, it's work.
Yeah. Even when it's generally like that.
Yeah.
yeah, even when it's painterly, it's labor. There's
Mhm.
so much setup and takedown for sure. I also in the studio feel like I'm in trouble for doing the things that I'm doing sometimes. Like
Yeah.
the print gods are like not cool with some of the choices.
Well, because there's a huge tradition in printmaking, and there are like
Mhm.
certain things like that are, you do this, this, and this.
Mhm.
And especially depending upon your instructor that you may have had, they may have followed a very formal, like, nope, that's the way it is. That's how my instructor was in undergrad. So, yeah, I could see how that is. This is from one of my colleagues, Maura Lyons. Why is the tactile an important vehicle for cultural or family memory? And I will add her initial question. Could you talk more about the relationship between memory, often thought of as dematerialized, and your tactile processes?
Go ahead.
I think for me, I find like I need to be active when I'm creating. I need personally to be able to touch things and to feel things. There's a comfort to that for me. And then I realized with the end products that a lot of times there's, I'm seeking comfort because I'm trying to ground myself in the memories of my ancestors. I'm trying to commune with them. So I'm seeking comfort in that. And then I create these things that are kind of like pillows that like you would hug or cuddle up with or, drape over you. So it's an interesting for me, just like this kind of interesting circular kind of thing. I'm seeking comfort. I'm creating comfort. Um, I also, I like that people also respond to the art in that way. I like that they want to touch it. I like that they say, oh, I wish I could like cuddle with that. So in hindsight, it's just in the last few weeks, that's something that I've been thinking about as a part of my practice and how that fits in and what that kind of means um, for the viewers and how I feel about that. So yeah, I also feel like for me, memories are also tactile. So memories for me come in the form of smells, and come in the form of of touch. So those are things that kind of trigger memory for me. And the things that I sometimes even pick up because I think, oh, I just like that. And then realize later that, oh, like, that's reminiscent of, a blouse that an aunt or my mother had, or just, those kinds of things.
Yeah.
Yeah, I agree. I think that memory is, for me, probably touch and smell first. That's how those things hit me mostly. But generally, I have sort of a feeling about culturally that we privilege spoken and written ways of knowing, kinds of knowledge, and the symbolic over embodied and haptic ways of knowing. And so I think a lot about, alternative kinds of knowing and feminist theory in that sense. And I like to think about a kind of understanding that could supersede or be different than those kinds of rememberings or those kinds of more cerebral kinds of knowledge. And so I think that when I think about family and memory, I'm trying to think about how I could access people or events in a way that is somehow more direct or subverts the ways that we normally recall people. I don't know if that makes sense, but
yeah, I totally think that makes sense. And that is, that's why I stopped painting in grad school. I didn't realize that was why, but that's why I put the paints and the paintbrushes away. That's why I turned to handwork, was because like, you know, there's all of this stuff out here that I'm supposed to be learning, but it's not resonating with me. Like it's not touching upon like what I know, you know, to be real. And so very, yeah, I totally agree with that. Like I was just yeah, trying to tap into that knowledge. And then trying to find context for it. And finding some of the articles and the authors that you're talking about mentioning, and yeah, it opened up my practice, and you know, made me so much more excited to create.
Yeah, I want to find a new kind of language, I guess. It's sort of like I want a way around the language that we're given for connection. So that's part of it too, I think.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and I think we kind of feel like the written, like the limitations of certain things, especially within the English language. I think there's so many limitations with what you want to say and with words, you know, that just aren't there. This is from Ollie Greer. I think this is for you, Nicole.
Oh, let's see. So that quote was taken from one of the books that I had on Gee's Bend and Thornton Dial, who is another person who uses like, you know, anything from carpet to rope to clothing to animal carcasses in his paintings. And they're really amazing. So that was actually an introductory essay in one of the books on G-Span. If you Google her name, it'll come up. Yeah, the book will come up.
Nice. I think we're going to wrap up with that question. I could really talk with you guys for like another hour, to be honest. I actually have so many more questions from how like play works into your work and in your process, because it's something you both brought up, which I think is really important, that you still consider your studio practice as being a place to play. I wanted to talk more about ancestry, but we ran out of time. So thank you so much for being so generous by sharing your work and letting viewers peek into your practice and your background. Sincerely, it was great. So thank you so much. And viewers, please start following these two artists on Instagram. Ask all of your questions there as well. Look at their websites, buy artwork, and have a good night.
Thank you so much, Emily.
Yes.
And Nicole. It was great.
Yes, definitely. Thank you. This is great.
Bye.